I'd built a multi-million-dollar company from a small family business, but my father fired me and made my sister CEO. I grew up in a modest Texas suburb, the kind of place where people wear old baseball caps on weekends and head down to the local diner without worrying about the occasional oil stain on their jeans. My name is Alex Carter, and from the time I was a kid, I always felt like I was in someone else's shadow. Even though the family home was small, it seemed like there was a lot of extra space whenever my sister, Melanie, wasn't around. She was the bright star, the number one kid everybody wanted to see succeed. Meanwhile, I was more like a dim light bulb flickering in a dusty corner of the room. My dad, Richard Carter, owned a little computer shop tucked between a nail salon and a comic book store in a rundown strip mall. The sign outside flickered at night, and the window display usually featured one outdated desktop model collecting dust. Folks around town liked him, though they probably saw him as the guy who'd repair a broken laptop or replace a cracked phone screen at a decent price. He had the kind of quiet pride about his store that made him believe it would turn into a bustling business someday if he just stuck with it. But truth be told, the shop wasn't making much money, and we all knew it. Most of the family's hopes were pinned on Melanie's future, not on Dad's struggling store or on me, the son who seemed to wander through life like a spare part. Melanie was a perfect child in the eyes of everyone who mattered. She aced every subject, breezed through extracurricular activities, and got recruited into a prestigious business school in Boston. Whenever she came home on breaks, neighbors would pop in just to chat about her latest successes. They never asked much about me, so I never bothered to share details of what I was doing. Even if I did, I was sure it would never measure up to her triumphs. I knew I'd have to figure out my own way, so I didn't waste time feeling sorry for myself. From the outside looking in, it might have seemed like a standard family dynamic. The shining daughter, the struggling father who cared more about the store's survival than fun family vacations, and the overlooked son. Inside my head, it felt like I was stuck in the nosebleed seats while Melanie performed center stage in a packed stadium. Everyone cheered for her, including our relatives and my dad's buddies, who used to hang out at the shop. They spent more time talking about her potential than about the next gadget Dad would fix. Sometimes I wonder if anyone noticed I existed at all. I always sensed that Dad was disappointed that my interests didn't line up with what he considered lucrative. He respected technology. After all, he ran that small business with a handful of dusty computers, but he didn't see me as a future mogul or anything close. He seemed too busy worrying about bills and repairs, never quite considering that I might have a talent of my own. He poured whatever resources he had into making sure Melanie could study in comfort, and I completely understood that it made sense from a practical standpoint. She was a sure bet, and I was just there, a kid who had a slight knack for tinkering around with programs. Since I wasn't going to get any scholarships that paid for my dorm or textbooks, I juggled multiple part-time jobs while studying at a local college. On weekdays, I attended classes on computer science and general programming, and on weekends, I stocked shelves at a grocery store, making sure I had enough money to cover rent in the cheapest apartment I could find. My roommate at the time was a wild character who blasted music at random hours, so I'd escape to the library whenever I could. That was where I started messing around with small coding projects. Nothing big at first, just scripts that helped me organize my schedule or figure out ways to automate basic tasks. One day, I stumbled onto an idea while reading about how different businesses handle their stock and supplies. It seemed like a lot of small shops around my neighborhood had trouble keeping track of items that sold out fast or expired quickly. I was curious enough to start coding a little prototype for a system that would log and monitor stock levels in real time. It wasn't fancy, but it worked for the grocery store where I was employed. The manager told me that he appreciated having a better sense of what was running low. That was enough motivation to keep going, even though I didn't have any illusions of turning this into a massive hit. At least, not yet. As I refined this inventory management software, I realized that other places might find it useful, too. Over time, a couple of local businesses, like a small bakery and a nearby hardware store, heard about my program. They asked me to set it up for them. All of a sudden, I was receiving calls at odd hours with questions about customizing features or adding new modules to track specific items. My idea was evolving into something more valuable than the random projects I'd done before. Being busy with requests felt good, because it meant I finally had a tangible skill people respected. I didn't talk much about it to my family, since I assumed they wouldn't really care. My dad was usually occupied with the daily grind at the store, and Melanie was away in Boston, charging forward with her big plans. But then, at some point, Dad must have heard from one of his friends that I developed a useful little system for small businesses around town. He didn't rush to applaud me or anything, but he did start asking questions about it. I could sense the skepticism behind his inquiries, as if he was trying to figure out if there was any real future in what I was doing. Some days later, he casually mentioned that I could swing by his shop and see if I could improve the way he tracked spare parts and repair materials. I felt a little spark of hope that maybe this was his way of acknowledging that I had a legitimate skill. So I brought my laptop over to the store. It smelled like dusty motherboards and cheap printer ink. The shelves were lined with used monitors, random cable adapters, and a bunch of those accessories people never buy. Dad hovered behind me as I typed lines of code, integrating an inventory module into his outdated system. He observed the interface, tested a feature or two, and then nodded slowly, as though he was thinking that maybe I wasn't a lost cause. That was my daily routine for a while, tweaking the code, listening to any feedback he had, and fine-tuning little bugs. It didn't happen overnight, but he gradually opened up about his own struggles with the store. He mentioned how frustrating it was to keep track of all the small items that customers needed for quick repairs. He admitted that if he ran out of a certain cable or motherboard, it meant losing that day's sale to a bigger competitor. My program gave him a kind of early warning system so that he'd know when supplies were running low, letting him reorder in advance. It was simple, but the payoff was big for a place as small as his. I wasn't sure how Dad felt about me or my program after I finished the first working version. He wasn't the type to shower anyone with praise. Yet one morning, I noticed a small but distinct shift in the way he talked about business in front of me. He seemed a bit more optimistic, even hinting that the store might expand its services beyond basic repairs. That was when I truly felt like the door was cracking open a little. I remembered thinking that if I could keep improving my system, I might prove to him that I was worth betting on. Maybe not as much as Melanie, but enough to be recognized as a valuable member of the family. A few weeks went by, and local news spread. More small businesses around town discovered my inventory software, and word of mouth turned into a steady trickle of new clients. Suddenly, I was writing different versions, customizing features for a mechanic's garage, a small clothing boutique, and a local electronics wholesaler. The project started to feel like a real company, something that might break out a local bubble if I kept at it. My college workload was still demanding, but I squeezed in time for everything, fueled by the idea that I might finally make something of myself on my own terms. One day, I found Dad beaming at the store as he told me about how a slightly bigger tech shop nearby had noticed we were running a more efficient operation. It turned out they were curious about our system. I was stunned to see Dad looking excited, almost proud as he described how the new software kept our shelves well-stocked and our expenses relatively low. That was all the proof I needed to realize I was onto something more significant than I had ever imagined back when I was just scribbling code in the library. It was a strange but uplifting feeling to see that spark in his eyes. A part of me never believed it could happen. I had always felt overshadowed, a leftover piece of my own home, never the star. Yet here I was, watching my father show me, in his own guard way, that he finally saw me as someone who could make a genuine impact. It wasn't a moment of fanfare or applause, but it was enough to inspire me to push further. I got my foot in the door, and now I wanted to build something that could stand on its own. My next steps were uncertain, but I knew I couldn't lose this momentum. A sudden wave of determination told me that I needed to prove I belonged in that world where real accomplishments were celebrated. I told myself that I would not let this opportunity slip away. As I walked out of that little computer shop at sunset, breathing in the hot Texas air, I sensed that everything might be about to change. For once, I felt more than an afterthought. I felt like I was on the right path, and it gave me a quiet thrill that was unlike anything I'd known before. I never told anyone how intense that moment was for me. It marked the first time in my life when I sensed that maybe I wasn't doomed to remain a footnote. I had waited so long to feel a genuine sense of pride radiating from my dad that I almost didn't trust it at first. But it was real. I held on to the idea that if the store thrived with my software, there could be a future where my achievements counted for something, even if Melanie's accomplishments always loomed large. And that's when I made my decision. I would keep improving my program, adding new features and marketing it to anyone willing to give it a shot. I wasn't sure how big it could grow, but I had a hunch that if I just kept at it, maybe one day it would be more than a local curiosity. I clung to that moment of validation, determined not to let it fade into wishful thinking. Little did I know, that wave of success was going to carry me into an entirely different world, one filled with just as many pitfalls as triumphs. I remember stepping out onto the sidewalk, bags slung over my shoulder, feeling a rare sense of hope. The sun dipped below the horizon, and a car horn blared somewhere off in the distance. It seemed like every little detail was heightened, reminding me that this was my life, my chance to stand up and be seen. There was no way I was going to let it slip away. For the first time, I allowed myself to dream a little bigger, imagining a future that would surprise everyone, especially me. Something inside told me that things would never be the same. I was determined to hold on to the promise of that moment, ready to face whatever came next. I didn't know it then, but I was about to discover how quickly circumstances can evolve, pushing me to grow beyond anything I'd ever anticipated. The road ahead would bring challenges I wasn't prepared for, but I felt more alive than ever. I was finally ready to try, even if it meant risking everything I thought I knew about myself and my family. This was the start of something new, and I could feel it brewing, like a storm gathering just over the horizon. I couldn't wait to see how far my efforts would take me, and I sensed that maybe, just maybe, I was about to prove my worth in a way no one else expected. The excitement in my chest reminded me that there was only one direction to go now, and that was forward. I remember the day I officially finished college, as if it were a snapshot in time. The second I stepped off the stage, I had already mapped out the next few years of my life in my head. Staying idle was never an option, so I dropped straight into a work schedule that had me living on energy bars and cheap coffee. The original plan involved sticking around Dad's store for a while and refining my inventory management software, but it evolved into something way bigger than I expected. Before I knew it, the humble little computer shop morphed into a thriving tech startup called Carter Innovations. The name felt ambitious, but I decided it was time the family reached past the confines of that aging strip mall. For 5 years, I ran on adrenaline long nights and occasional scolding from my landlord about the bizarre hours I kept. My first office was basically a small back room in the shop, which I transformed into my personal command center. Sleeping on an old couch while listening to the hum of leftover servers felt like an odd sort of luxury. With no employees to handle the grunt work at the start, I juggled everything from coding to hauling boxes of refurbished monitors. It wasn't glamorous, but I loved it. The more hours I poured in, the more I felt I was carving out something uniquely mine. Months rolled into years as I refined the software, pitched it to more businesses, and slowly built a solid client base. It amazed me how quickly word spread once a couple local stores sang our praises, especially in a place like Texas, where folks actually talk to their neighbors. After the initial buzz, I put every dime I earned back into the operation. I could have bought a nicer car or a better place to live, but I stuck with my battered old truck and cramped apartment, so I could keep funding expansions. My thinking was pretty straightforward. If I was going to grow this company, I had to act like every penny mattered. In time, I hired a few folks who were just as passionate about working weekends as I was. They believed in the product, and that belief fueled them to pull the same crazy hours I did. Dad's reaction was interesting. On one hand, he liked having a bustling office in place of what used to be a lonely store, but on the other, he was used to a small-scale operation. Watching me grow Carter Innovations from a local outfit into something that could negotiate real investor deals left him in a state of cautious pride. He sometimes wandered in, offering old-school business tips he picked up from running that dusty shop, but the pace of the tech world often baffled him. Still, seeing me juggle negotiations and product launches made him stand a little taller, which was a sight I learned to appreciate. Things really took off around the 5-year mark. We landed a contract with a regional chain of electronic stores, one that had shops spread across multiple states. Suddenly, we were no longer some backyard tech experiment. The jump in revenue was huge, and my days turned into a blur of phone calls, software updates, and frantic flights to meet new clients. By the end of that year, we had a swelling bank account and a handful of serious investors. It felt surreal to check the company's financial statements and see numbers that didn't seem remotely possible a few years prior. At that point, struggling local kid no longer fit my description. Now I was the face of a fast-growing startup, a role I never dreamed would be mine. But like anyone in the startup world knows, success can attract unexpected complications. Right around the time we started landing the big money deals, my sister Melanie waltzed back into town. She arrived as if she'd been tracking my progress with a stopwatch, waiting for the perfect moment to show up. She had always been the star in the family, with a shiny business degree from Boston. I expected to cross paths eventually, but the way she materialized felt a bit too convenient. She knocked on my office door one morning, wearing a carefully curated outfit and sporting a smile that suggested she was ready to take charge. There was no direct explanation for why she had chosen that moment to come back, but she made it clear she wanted to help the company. The funny part was, I never heard her mention Carter Innovations before we started raking in real money. She spent years blazing her own trail in places like New York and Los Angeles, presumably scoring jobs that promised big salaries and corner offices. Then, all of a sudden, she was planted in front of my desk, telling me about fresh ideas to expand the brand. The surprising bit was how Dad reacted. Instead of inviting her to observe first or letting her ease into a role, he stepped forward and declared that she should be co-CEO. No probation, no testing the waters, no sideways glance to see if I was okay with it. Just a snap decision, like he was tossing me a casual suggestion to pick up milk at the store. It stung more than I wanted to admit, but I initially pushed that aside. I told myself that maybe having someone with a formal business education could actually help. After all, she had that fancy degree and probably more knowledge of corporate strategy than I did. So if Dad believed it would take Carter Innovations further, I was willing to roll with it. I rationalized that I'd stay focused on the product and keep everything running behind the scenes. She could handle press, investor updates, and all that public-facing stuff that made me squirm. However, that arrangement started shifting almost immediately. In a matter of weeks, Melanie became the star of every investor meeting. She was the one scheduled to appear on business panels and local TV segments. I got invited to fewer and fewer discussions where major decisions were being made. Even the staff, many of whom I hired personally, started looking to her for final approval on things that fell under my domain. It felt like I was being phased out of my own creation in real time, and it was startling how quickly it happened. There was no confrontation or dramatic conflict. It was more like a slow fade where I became background noise. Investors started calling her to get updates, and she would deliver polished presentations with a confidence that overshadowed my straightforward approach. She had a knack for telling a compelling story, weaving buzzwords and figures into a neat package. The ironic part was that all those achievements stemmed from the code and systems I had developed over countless sleepless nights, yet the spotlight landed squarely on her. My father, enamored by her polished style and old habit of surpassing all expectations, seemed more than happy with the new arrangement. The tension built up in ways that felt subtle but heavy. Employees still respected me, but now they saw two CEOs with very different perspectives. I was a grounded one who loved digging into the technical weeds, while Melanie charmed the press, signed deals, and moved us into a bigger downtown office without asking for my input. The expansion was no small thing, but I found out about it at the same time as everyone else, via an all-staff email outlining the details of the new building. I skimmed through the paragraphs describing how it was a sign of our maturity as a company, feeling a pit form in my stomach. I wasn't even sure what my next move should be. The strangest part was hearing her talk in interviews about the vision for Carter Innovations, giving the impression that it was a joint dream we had always shared. She addressed the cameras with a tone that suggested she had been part of every late-night code session, every tough meeting with early clients, and every frustrating revision of the software. It felt like watching a rework of my own life story, but recast with her as the creative force behind everything. The sinking realization hit me that, to the outside world, she was now the protagonist. I was a side character who occasionally popped up in the credits. Melanie's new media presence turned her into the face of our startup. Magazines and news outlets loved her background. Small-town genius returns from the big city to transform a local business into a contender on the national stage. It was a neat narrative, so everyone ate it up. At first, I tried to take it all in stride. After all, the company was thriving, and I was still the one writing new code, improving the software, and guiding our tech team. The money was rolling in, morale was good, and the brand was hotter than ever. But in quiet moments, I found myself itching to speak up, to prove that I was a real engine behind the company's success. Yet Dad seemed thrilled that Melanie was propelling the business to new heights. Her partnerships and expansions brought big returns, and he liked seeing the Carter name glowing in the limelight. With time, I realized that I couldn't ignore the creeping frustration any longer. The final straw was watching her accept an industry award on behalf of Carter Innovations. Standing on a stage I felt was more rightfully mine. She rattled off stats and joked about the early days in a way that made it sound like she was the one who overcame sleepless nights. The crowd lapped it up, applauding her as if she were a lone pioneer. I found myself in the audience, politely clapping while a friend next to me shot me a sympathetic glance. On paper, everything looked perfect. Carter Innovations was thriving, and the Carter siblings were at the helm. But beneath that glossy surface, I felt the tension building. My pride told me to demand recognition, but I also worried about shattering the family dynamic we'd managed to maintain up to that point. If I spoke up and confronted Melanie, Dad might see it as me undermining the success she'd delivered. Investors might interpret it as instability at the top, which could ripple through the company's growth. Meanwhile, staying silent only let her keep overshadowing me. It was a balancing act I wasn't sure how long I could maintain. I tried to remind myself that I had worked too hard to lose momentum over a bruised ego. The money, the growth, the success, none of those things felt entirely mine anymore, yet I clung to hope that I'd find a way to keep my original vision intact. Part of me wondered if Melanie and I could ever really align, or my father's decision to install her as co-CEO had already sealed my fate. For the time being, I tried to keep my head down and focus on the technology, the one aspect of the company I felt I still controlled. But it was impossible to ignore the creeping sense of displacement. Where once I was the engine driving every operation, I now felt like a passenger on a bus she was steering. The jokes around the office became more frequent, like quips about how I preferred coding to boardrooms, or how Melanie was the people person while I was a lab rat. These remarks were delivered playfully, but they cut deeper than I wanted to admit. The realization that my own employees saw me as secondary stung, even if they meant no harm. Looking back, the signs are clear. I was slowly being nudged out of my own spotlight, the one I'd toiled for long before Melanie reappeared. This was a new reality, and I wasn't sure I liked it. Still, I tried to stay positive, reminding myself that maybe the success of Carter Innovations was bigger than just my pride. As long as the company kept climbing, I tried to believe that a win for her was also a win for me. Yet, deep down, I sensed that a storm was brewing. If I couldn't find a way to claim my rightful role in the company I'd built, there was no telling how far I'd be pushed aside. My greatest fear was that eventually there would be no place left for me at Carter Innovations. I had to figure out a way to regain my footing before that happened. And that was where things stood. Carter Innovations soared higher with each passing quarter. Investors sang our praises, and Melanie was hailed as a visionary. Meanwhile, I remained in the background, unsure how much longer I could pretend it didn't bother me. It was a bizarre state of limbo, and every time I thought about confronting her, I imagined the fallout, both personal and professional. Taking that risk seemed monumental, but so did allowing her to rewrite the story of Carter Innovations as though I was a minor note in the company's journey. In that uneasy space, I waited, weighing my next move, torn between pushing back and keeping the peace. Part of me hoped that my sister might finally acknowledge how crucial I was. Another part doubted that day would ever come. The world saw a dynamic sibling duo at the helm of one of the fastest-growing startups around. I saw a stage with a single spotlight shining on someone else, leaving me in the shadows I'd once fought so hard to escape. And something told me that if I didn't act soon, I'd become just another footnote in the corporate world, overshadowed yet again. I still remember the day Dad turned 60, like it was some surreal movie scene. The celebration took place in one of the priciest hotels in Austin, the kind of grand ballroom where you expect to see celebrities sipping expensive champagne. My sister Melanie orchestrated everything, from the gourmet food to the extravagant decor. She had a knack for dazzling a crowd, and this was her opportunity to show off. The guest list included high-profile investors, local business leaders, extended family, and even some folks I barely recognized but pretended to know. It felt like everyone who mattered in our industry was there, eager to watch the Carter family display its success. From the moment I walked in, I knew this evening was going to be more than just a birthday gathering. The very sight of the towering floral arrangements and ornate ice sculptures hinted that something big was about to happen. It was hard to ignore how Melanie moved through the room like a seasoned politician, nodding and smiling at each new guest who approached. I found myself drifting to the periphery, shaking hands and making small talk with acquaintances, many of whom only recognized me from old press releases or occasional mentions in the local business journal. Seeing my father at the center of it all reminded me of how far we'd come from that dusty little computer shop, but also highlighted the distance growing between me and the rest of the family. Dad looked happy. He wore a suit that, in any other context, would seem out of place, but tonight it matched the opulence of the venue. The guests showered him with congratulations and heartfelt tributes to his life's work. For a fleeting moment, I felt proud to be there. He deserved some acknowledgement for raising 2 children, who had managed to steer a small-town operation into a multi-million-dollar enterprise. Part of me hoped this event might mend some fences, maybe even bring us closer. I had no illusions that things would magically revert to how they used to be, but I believed there was room for a peaceful balance if we handled the situation right. The music lowered at one point, and Melanie made her way to the stage. Everyone went quiet. She had a commanding presence that made people listen, even if they had no clue about the finer details of our business. The announcer introduced her with a glowing summary of her credentials, painting her as a visionary who had guided our company from a modest startup to a player in the tech world. There was no mention of how Carter Innovations existed long before she arrived, fueled by countless nights I spent alone, hammering out code. I tried not to let that sour my mood. After all, this was supposed to be Dad's big night, not my personal therapy session. As Melanie took the microphone, I sensed a wave of anticipation rolling through the crowd. She thanked everyone for attending, offered a light-hearted nod to the family's journey, and congratulated Dad on turning 60 with a flourish that made the audience chuckle politely. I began to relax, thinking the evening might pass without incident. Then she shifted the focus to the company's future. Her tone changed slightly, as though she had been rehearsing this moment for weeks. My stomach twisted in a knot, and I noticed a few investors near the front edge of the stage leaning forward, eager to catch every word. She made an announcement that turned the entire atmosphere on its head. She stated she was assuming the role of the sole CEO of Carter Innovations. She framed it as a logical step forward, something about consolidating leadership for the sake of efficiency. She said she appreciated my technical contributions, but in her opinion, I lacked the leadership qualities necessary to handle an executive role in a rapidly evolving market. She used phrases that sounded polite on the surface, but the implication was clear. I had just been demoted in public, stripped of any co-leadership title I had held. The air in that grand ballroom seemed to freeze. I caught sight of Dad, standing to the side with a fixed smile. He gave no sign of protest, offered no defense of my record as the founder who built the backbone of this company. The hush that fell over the room felt deafening, despite the crowd of onlookers. Every face I looked at wore some blend of curiosity or polite confusion. Some people seemed to be waiting for me to explode. Others looked uncomfortable, probably realizing how inappropriate it was for such a personal shakeup to happen at a public celebration. For a split second, I entertained the idea of grabbing a microphone and laying out the real story. I pictured myself recounting how I once slept in the office, coding inventory systems that made the company what it was. I imagined highlighting the sleepless weekend spent negotiating deals before Melanie even cared about Carter Innovations. A part of me was furious at the brazenness of this stunt, especially on Dad's birthday. It was a calculated move, and it worked. She had me cornered in front of an influential audience, with no graceful way to object. A meltdown would undermine not only me, but also the company's reputation, and I couldn't afford that. In the end, I swallowed my anger. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt a wave of embarrassment wash over me. By the time Melanie concluded her speech, the audience had erupted into polite applause. Some looked uncertain about whether to clap, but did it anyway, because that's what social situations demand. I glimpsed a few people glancing in my direction, possibly expecting me to react. I forced a neutral smile, reminding myself that losing composure could cost me any remaining goodwill I had within the organization. She left the stage, triumphant in her carefully choreographed move. Dad walked over to congratulate her, placing an arm around her shoulder while beaming at the guests, as if this outcome was perfectly acceptable. My stomach churned. I recalled all the times I'd yearned for a hint of validation from him, each memory now tainted by the sight of him cheering for a decision that effectively elbowed me aside. In that moment, it dawned on me that this might not be Melanie's game alone. He might have supported her from the start, trusting her polished business approach more than my scrappy brand of innovation. The party continued as if nothing monumental had happened. Waitstaff in crisp uniforms passed around platters of artisanal appetizers. Guests resumed their conversations, and the music picked up again. My mind raced with conflicting thoughts. Should I confront Melanie directly? Should I walk away and never look back? Should I gather the employees who still believed in me and mount some form of internal resistance? Ultimately, I took a deep breath and made a different call. I decided not to create a scene, especially not on my dad's birthday. I walked over to him, smiled stiffly, and handed him a gift bag containing a vintage watch I had spent weeks tracking down. He thanked me with a polite nod. There was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, as if he wondered what I was thinking. But he didn't speak up or clarify his stance on what had just transpired. The moment felt hollow, like a set piece in a play where everyone was pretending the script made sense. I offered a simple congratulation for reaching 60 years, and left before anyone could stop me. I made sure not to storm out or draw attention, choosing instead to slip away quietly. My steps echoed through the hallway as I headed for the parking lot, passing clusters of guests engrossed in conversation. None of them looked my way. They were too busy talking about the announcement, analyzing what it meant for Carter Innovations, or praising Melanie for her business savvy. I felt like a footnote in a story I had created, an unnamed contributor overshadowed by a more glamorous lead. Once outside, I lingered in the warm Texas night for a moment. The distant hum of traffic on the freeway merged with the faint music still emanating from the ballroom. A wave of disappointment washed over me. As I stood there, I recalled all the years I spent building my dream, only to watch it hijacked in front of a crowd. It felt like a punch to the gut, but I reminded myself that letting anger take over would only make me lose more than I already had. The world had seen me removed from my leadership position by my own sister, while my father signaled approval with a tight smile and silent nod. I drove home with my mind spinning. The swirl of headlights along the freeway made me feel disconnected, like I was watching someone else's life story unfold. Eventually, I reached my place, stumbled into my makeshift home office, and sank into the worn-out chair by my desk. I stared at the wall, half expecting some flash of clarity to break through. Instead, the realization took hold slowly, like an anchor dropping into deep water. I had lost control of Carter Innovations. I had lost the chance to shape the company in the image I had always envisioned. Worst of all, I felt like I had lost Dad's support in one fell swoop. Yet somewhere in that maze of disappointment, a determined spark began to stir. I couldn't ignore the fact that without my technical expertise, Carter Innovations couldn't sustain the innovation that had propelled it this far. Melanie might be a charismatic leader, but the core product still ran on the systems I had engineered. Investors might appreciate her polished persona, but they also needed the engine that drove our growth. That engine was me, and if I allowed myself to wallow in defeat, I'd be handing over the final piece of leverage I still possessed. I realized that I was down, but not out. The night felt like a turning point, the kind of moment that compels a person to decide whether they will retreat or push forward. I had every reason to walk away in disgust, but a part of me refused to let go. It wasn't just about the money or the title. It was about the principle of reclaiming the position I had earned through years of hard work. If I needed a reason to fight, Melanie had just given me the perfect one. I sat there in my darkened office, illuminated only by the faint glow of my computer screen, and began formulating a plan. I jotted a few notes, focusing on ways I could assert my influence on the product and keep an upper hand in future updates. Melanie might have the boardroom's ear, but I still understood the technical foundation better than anyone else. I also knew that, despite his silence, Dad might still be reachable in some small capacity if I approached things the right way. I tried to maintain hope, telling myself that this was just one more obstacle to overcome. The finality of that evening settled over me, yet I refused to sink into despair. I took a breath, cleared my thoughts, and reminded myself that resilience was the only card I had left to play. If Melanie and Dad were determined to sideline me, I would meet them head-on. They might have the spotlight at the glitzy parties, but I had spent too many years in the trenches to let them rewrite the future of Carter Innovations without me. I wasn't ready to concede. I would find a way to reclaim my place, or I'd go down swinging. One thing was certain. The fight was far from over. It was about 3 a.m. when I fired up my laptop and began drafting messages that would change the entire trajectory of Carter Innovations. My makeshift home office looked like a mini war room, scattered with half-empty coffee cups and scribbled notes pinned to the walls. Instead of feeling exhausted, I was riding a late-night surge of energy fueled by frustration, adrenaline, and a bit of satisfaction at finally having a plan. There was no turning back. I had spent the previous hours sorting through legal documents, double-checking shared distributions, and confirming the status of the software rights. By the time the clock ticked past midnight, I was armed with everything I needed to launch a counteroffensive. I began by sending a carefully worded letter to all the major clients who depended on the technology one had originally built. Many of them had joined Carter Innovations back when it was a tiny outfit with a clunky website and a couple of local business deals. Over the years, I had personally guided them through each new software release and update. Deep down, I believed most of them would stand by me if I could explain the real nature of my arrangement with Carter Innovations. In the email, I outlined the specifics of who truly owned the core software they used every day. No sensational claims, just factual statements and documentation attached for reference. By the time I hit send, my fingers trembled slightly, but I also felt a surge of relief that the truth was finally out there. Next, I drafted an internal memo to the key employees I trusted, especially the development team that had been with me through countless sleepless nights. Many of them had accepted job offers not because of my sister's slick presentations, but because they believe in the software's potential and my ability to guide them through each complicated step of building it. I laid out the same facts for them. The code base that drove 80% of the company's revenue was never fully transferred to Carter Innovations. I had established a separate legal entity years ago, back when the entire project was in its infancy. At the time, I thought it was a sensible move to safeguard my intellectual property, in case things ever went sideways. My father, busy with daily operations at the shop, had never bothered to delve deep into the corporate structure. My sister, who arrived later, never paid enough attention to those fine print details either. Now, ironically, those details were my lifeline. I recalled how, about 2 years into the company's growth, my father had needed a little extra cash for an office expansion and a shortfall in inventory. I was the only one ready to cover that gap at the time. In return, he gave me 6% of his shares in a private transaction, treating it like a casual family arrangement. He probably assumed we'd always be in sync, so he didn't think twice about the implications. It turned out I already had 45% from my original investment stake. That small 6% gave me the majority share, 51%. Nobody outside the immediate family had taken the time to recalculate those numbers in the years since. My father trusted me to keep the company afloat, barely glanced at the paperwork he signed. Melanie was busy climbing corporate ladders elsewhere, so she never noticed a shift in ownership either. As I hit send on those final messages, the outlines of my plan began to feel real. The chain reaction would be set in motion by sunrise. Key clients would understand that Carter Innovations no longer had the legal right to license the software if I chose to revoke it. Employees who reported directly to me in my separate entity would have clarity on their positions and job security. For the first time since Melanie's power play, I sensed the ground shifting back in my favor. No loud declarations, no dramatic press conferences, just a quiet unveiling of facts that had been there all along. When the sun crept over the horizon, I found myself getting ready for what I suspected would be a tense day at the office. The drive over felt strangely calm, as if my brain had decided that I'd done all the panicking I could handle for one night. My old truck rumbled through morning traffic, passing drivers on their way to regular 9-to-5 jobs. I felt a pang of nostalgia for a time when my biggest worry was finishing a coding project on time, long before things spiraled into this power struggle. The cityscape slid by as I rehearsed how I would handle the confrontation about to unfold. Stepping into the lobby of our sleek downtown headquarters, I sensed the usual bustle of employees lining up at the coffee station, exchanging weekend stories, and getting ready for the day's tasks. A few folks shot me curious looks as I walked toward the elevator. They might have already seen my email, or they might have simply detected an odd energy in the air. Once I reached the executive floor, I headed straight to the boardroom without greeting anyone. That little pang of anxiety in my chest reminded me I had to stand firm in whatever happened next. Melanie and Dad were already there, flipping through some papers and wearing matching expressions of annoyance. They must have been expecting me to either bow out or show up ready for a confrontation, but they looked oddly unprepared when I calmly took a seat and placed a folder of documents on the table. For a few seconds, there was an uncomfortable silence. If I had to guess, they were trying to read my expression, hunting for any trace of hesitation. I wasn't about to give them the satisfaction. From the corner of my eye, I noticed Dad's face shift when he saw the folder labeled with the entity I had founded years ago. Melanie's glare stiffened, and she flipped to a page that clearly outlined a separate licensing agreement for the software. Without me needing to say a word, the reality was spelled out in black and white. Carter Innovations did not own the most profitable product in our portfolio. The investors might have assumed otherwise. The press might have assumed otherwise. But legally speaking, that code base belonged solely to my private corporation. In other words, if I walked out of the building that morning and took my software with me, Carter Innovations would lose a massive chunk of its business. The mood in the room shifted from irritation to alarm in record time. Melanie skimmed the text, no doubt searching for a loophole or an angle she could exploit. Dad looked like he was reliving the moment he signed those shares over to me, possibly wondering how he could have overlooked the significance of that deal. Before either of them could launch into damage control, I calmly pointed out that I also retained a 51% majority stake in Carter Innovations itself. That was the second bombshell, effectively confirming that all the swagger my sister had displayed at the birthday party was built on a precarious assumption that nobody had revisited our ownership structure. There was a sense of collective panic as I explained the situation. I painted a clear picture. If the software rights and the majority shares were tied to me, then Carter Innovations couldn't continue its operations the way Melanie had planned unless I approved it. The revenue streams depended on the code I had created, and the staff who maintained that code looked to me for guidance. Investors might be dazzled by Melanie's presentations, but the technical foundation required my ongoing support. It was hard not to feel a jolt of satisfaction watching Melanie, and Dad realized how vulnerable their position was. I recalled every late-night coding session, every call with clients, every glitch I had personally fixed over the years. Those memories fueled my confidence as I delivered the final piece of news. They would have to accept one of two options. The first was that I would walk away, taking my software and my ownership shares with me. The company would essentially become an empty shell, without the product that fueled its success. The second option was more dramatic, but offered Carter Innovations a chance to survive. Melanie and Dad could step down, leaving me with full control to run the company as I saw fit. The ultimatum hung in the air like a thundercloud. I didn't raise my voice or lean forward aggressively, because I didn't need to. The facts were all in front of them, laid out in a matter-of-fact way that left no room for negotiation. When I glanced around the room, I noticed a small group of employees, some from legal, some from management, peering in from the hallway, trying to gauge what was happening without crossing any lines. They looked rattled, which was understandable. They had joined Carter Innovations, expecting a stable environment. Now it appeared that the entire structure could collapse based on how this conversation ended. A swirl of conflicted emotions bubbled under my calm exterior. Part of me felt relief at finally standing up for myself. Another part felt sadness that things had reached such a hostile point with my father and sister. This was never my dream scenario. I had always hoped to build a collaborative family business, one that took advantage of everyone's strengths. But there was no getting around the fact that I had been publicly humiliated and my contribution had been systematically downplayed. This was the only way to reclaim what was rightfully mine. There were no theatrics, no grand speeches, just the cold, hard facts. They could either release the reins or watch the company crumble within weeks. After everything that had happened, I felt oddly detached, like I was observing the scene from a distance. The tension in the room reached a new peak, and for once, Melanie didn't have a snappy response. Even Dad, who usually tried to find a middle ground, seemed lost for words. I had to stifle a wry grin as I pictured the frantic phone, calls they would soon be making to lawyers and accountants, desperately searching for a way around the paperwork. The truth was that I had done my homework. I knew the documentation was airtight. My father's grin at his birthday party, when Melanie declared herself the sole CEO, flashed in my mind. That moment had pushed me to make my move. Now, they could face the consequences of underestimating me and failing to account for how deeply I had anchored my role within the company's foundation. Nothing was decided yet, but the power dynamics had flipped in an instant. One of two outcomes would emerge from this showdown. Either I would walk away with my intellectual property and majority stake, or they would concede the leadership of Carter Innovations back to me. Either way, the days of me being sidelined and treated like a throwaway tech guy were over. The final call was in my hands, and I felt a swell of resolve as I braced for fallout. It wasn't revenge for revenge's sake. It was the only method to protect what I had spent years of my life creating. I glanced at the clock on the boardroom wall and realized the entire exchange had unfolded in under an hour, but it felt like the turning point of a lifetime. I closed the folder, gathered my things, and prepared to leave him with the reality I had laid out. In that moment, I understood one fundamental truth. No matter how smoothly someone might talk, or how convincingly they might command a room, the real power rests with the person who knows where the heart of the business lies. In this case, that was me, and I finally had the leverage to prove it. By the time the boardroom meeting ended, I felt the weight of years of unspoken tension lift off my shoulders, replaced by a mixture of triumph and uneasy calm. The writing was on the wall for Melanie and my father. Either step aside or watch Carter Innovations collapse. Nobody said much as I left, but their faces spoke volumes. They had gone from wielding all the influence in the company to scrambling for some semblance of control. I returned to my desk that day knowing I'd changed the course of my own life, yet there was an odd emptiness hovering at the edges of my victory. Within a week, my sister and my father removed themselves from daily operations. The official line was that Melanie had chosen to pursue new opportunities, and Dad, who had just turned 60, decided to retire. Most people in the company knew something had gone down behind closed doors, but the everyday hustle moved so fast that only a handful of employees paid much attention to gossip. For all practical purposes, I was now the head of Carter Innovations in every sense. Majority shareholder, sole owner of the main software, and the final decision-maker on corporate strategy. Dad kept a minority stake, but it came with no voting rights, so he was effectively sidelined. Melanie's name vanished from the leadership page on our website, replaced by a brief note thanking her for her contributions. That was more courtesy than she had shown me when she seized the CEO title at Dad's birthday party. Despite my outward confidence, the aftermath felt complicated. I came into the office one afternoon and found that Dad had emptied his corner, the one he'd occupied for decades. The stale smell of his old cologne lingered in the carpet, and the walls were bare except for faded spots where family photos once hung. The silence hit me harder than I expected. Sure, I've been fighting for respect, but watching the old guard vanish overnight felt strange. Even if he hadn't always had my back, he was still my father, and Carter Innovations had started out as a small store. Now he was gone, leaving behind only the husk of a memory that was equal parts pride and regret. A few days later, Mom, Diana, turned up at my door unannounced. She was the kind of person who liked to keep the peace and often stayed on the sidelines during family disputes. Seeing her standing on my doorstep, holding a plate of homemade cookies, brought a flood of childhood memories rushing in. She didn't lecture me, but I could sense her sadness about how everything had unraveled. It hurt to realize that I'd effectively ripped the family apart to secure my place in a company I loved. She didn't have to say anything for me to understand her disappointment. Still, there was a quiet acceptance in her expression. She acknowledged that I'd done what needed to be done, and that sometimes protecting what you built comes at a heavy cost. That evening, we sat together in my living room. I found myself explaining my side of the story, even though Mom probably already knew every detail. She rested her hand on mine and nodded at the right moments, letting me know she understood my reasoning. I was grateful for that, yet I couldn't shake the realization that my choice had effectively shattered the Carter family dynamic. Melanie and Dad might never see me the same way again. Mom seemed caught between wanting to mend bridges and recognizing that certain lines had been crossed. When she eventually left, the house felt emptier than before. In the following weeks, I buried myself in work to keep from dwelling on family drama. The guilt and relief formed a strange cocktail in my mind. I was proud of claiming what was rightfully mine, but the personal fallout gnawed at me in quieter moments. Each day, I reminded myself that if I hadn't acted, I would have been pushed out entirely. Hard as it was to take charge, it was better than letting my own creation slip away. Sure, people whisper about the abrupt shift in leadership, but our biggest client stuck with us, and a large chunk of the engineering team was on my side. The knowledge that Carter Innovations could finally operate without meddling or flashy PR stunts calmed my nerves. Once the dust settled, I set out to make changes that aligned with my original vision. I bolstered our research and development budget, hired fresh talent, and launched new product lines that capitalized on our core software. The pace of innovation skyrocketed. Clients appreciated the renewed focus on what worked, solid technology backed by a support team that understood their needs. My newly minted executives turned out to be people who valued substance over style, a welcome departure from the pageantry that had once defined our leadership. About a year later, the numbers spoke louder than any press release could. We had tripled our annual profits, expanded into new markets, and created a few groundbreaking features that set the industry buzzing. The team thrived on the momentum, and our once quiet office now bustled with energy. One day, I looked around at the rows of developers and product managers bringing fresh ideas to life, and I realized that Carter Innovations had become everything I had dreamed it could be: dynamic, forward-thinking, and fearless. Around that time, I received a formal invitation from the business school, where Melanie had earned her degrees. The administration wanted me to speak at their graduation ceremony. The topic they suggested was the power of underestimated people. My first instinct was to laugh at the irony. Would Melanie be in the audience, rolling her eyes? Would she still be telling herself that I was merely a tech guy? Despite the oddity of it all, I decided to accept. Maybe I wanted to prove a point, or maybe I just wanted to show that sometimes the unassuming kid from Texas can stand at the podium and deliver a message that resonates. A few weeks later, I found myself on stage in front of fresh-faced graduates who were about to enter a business world full of hidden minefields and towering opportunities. I talked about adversity, about the feeling of being overshadowed, and how important it is to hold onto your convictions even when others doubt you. I avoided cheap motivational cliches. Instead, I shared the rougher edges of my story: the lost sleep, the backstabbing, and the eventual realization that nobody else will protect your dreams if you don't do it yourself. The crowd listened with rapt attention, nodding here and there in that way people do when something strikes a chord. Afterward, as I walked off stage, I spotted a few familiar faces in the faculty section. Some recognized me from newspaper articles featuring Carter Innovation's recent success. I wondered if Melanie had ever told them her side of the story. But I shrugged off the thought, reminding myself that none of that mattered anymore. This was my moment, not hers. The best revenge was never about tearing somebody down. It was about rising so high that the people who try to stifle you end up questioning their choices. I might have lost some measure of family unity, but I gained self-respect and a thriving company. If my father and sister ever wanted to make amends, they'd know where to find me. Until then, I'd keep pressing forward. As I left the auditorium, greeting well-wishers and exchanging handshakes, I felt a surge of gratitude for the journey that had led me there, for the triumphs and the heartbreak that had shaped me into the person I was becoming. The experience taught me one simple truth. Success is sweeter when it's forged by your own vision and resilience, especially when everyone else once thought you were just a footnote in someone else's story.